Morning. I'm V, formerly Eve Ensler, and I'm honored to be here at Riverside Church this morning. I come to you as many things. I come as a woman who has at times been lost and anxious and despaired, and I come to you as a woman who has known the deepest bliss, contentment in love. I come as a woman who has loved men and women, and a woman who has been terrified of intimacy. I come as an artist who's been saved by the act of creation, and I come as an activist giving what I needed the most. I come as a friend, a mother, a sister, a daughter, a rebel. I come as a white person whose ancestral legacy is responsible for murdering, stealing, pillaging, raping, and removing of the indigenous from their lands. 400 years of slavery, lynchings, murder, and rape of African Americans followed by Jim Crow, and continuing endless diabolical white supremacy through our active participation or through the blindness of privilege. And I come from Jewish ancestors erased in genocide. I come from the oppressed and the oppressor, the murderer and the murdered. These stories shame me and catalyze me every day. I come with mad hope and I come with outrage. I come with sorrow and I come with magic. I come with grief that feels so huge it could fill the oceans with my tears. I come knowing each one of us is divine, and I come knowing we are wildly imperfect. I come as a seeking human being, and I come as a know-it-all. I come as a white middle-class person who had many of the economic and racial privileges, and I come as a girl who was devastated by sexual violence beginning at the age of 5 from that same father of privilege and the murderous violence at his hands, which ravaged me until I left home at 18. I come to you with a heart breaking from the violence and hate of the world. And I come to you as a woman who is forever moved by the generosity and kindness of the many. I come to you as a person who wonders deeply if we humans have a future here on Earth. And I come to you as someone who will fight to the end to make sure we do. I come to you as a realist, and I come to you as a believer in miracles. This particular morning, I come to talk about the alchemy of the apology. In addressing our reading this morning, I chose it as an example of a public historic apology that moved a country, Australia, in a new direction. It isn't perfect. It's a beginning, though. Some ground rules for this talk. This is an offering, not a prescription, not a must-do, have-to, not the only way. It's an offering, period. Every survivor, every person has their own journey, their own process, their own timing. What works for one person may not work for another, and what works at one moment of your life may not work at another. I'm simply sharing my own experience, which is the thing I trust the most. There may be some things I say this morning that are difficult and hard to hear, so this is a little warning. Rule 2. When I use the word woman, I mean to include cisgender, transgender, non-binary. As I said, my early years were brutal and full of terror and pain. My father sexually abused me from the time I was 5 to 10, and after he stopped, he needed to erase what he had already destroyed, evidence, so he physically and emotionally battered me, almost murdering me until I left home. This abuse altered the constitutional makeup of my entire being. It filled my cells and blood and body with terror, worry, guilt, and dread that would, in my teenage years and on, even into my 60s, develop into an all-encompassing self-hatred and anxiety. The abuse created infections in my body and seriously compromised my immune system. In my 50s, I would get stage 3-4 uterine cancer. I am blessed to say that I have not had any cancer for 10 years, and it's quite a miracle. Their views froze me and made it almost impossible to concentrate or think. This had a terrible impact on my ability to study and learn. This reconfirmed my father's idea of me as a stupid person. The abuse made intimacy claustrophobic, made love foreign, made safety a pipe dream, and drew me constantly to dangerous situations and people in an attempt to master my past and my fear. The abuse led to addiction, alcohol, drugs, and promiscuity. I tell you all this not for your pity or sorrow. I tell you because when we talk about violence against women, it is always so abstract, so broad, so obscure. We don't realize the specific, detailed ways it injures and impacts our lives, and how many years, how much time it takes for us to rise from those ashes. I have been blessed that for years I was able to make my way as a waitress, and later I was doubly blessed that I made my way as a writer. So I was able to pay for some resources like therapy to help me lift the lid of that very dark period of my life. I certainly know others are not so fortunate. And I know if we lived in the world I dream of, we would take at least 70% of the money we spend on bombs and missiles and grenades and guns and war, and we would redirect it into a national trauma fund. So all those who are suffering from some kind of trauma, whether it be physical or sexual violence, ancestral violence, racial or gender violence, they could have the means and the resources and love and attention to recover. It would be our national priority alongside the Green New Deal, which would be our way of helping all the ways we have traumatized our Mother Earth. Can you imagine the outcome of a country that treated the trauma of its people rather than punishing them for being wounded or poor or mentally ill or homeless or broke or deprived or angry or violent? My father died 31 years ago, and for the years before he died and the years after, I have been waiting and waiting and waiting for him to make a reckoning, to be accountable, to make an apology. So finally, I decided 2 years ago to write his apology in his voice, with his words, to write the letter he would say all the things I needed to hear. That became the book, The Apology. The apology required time. It could not be rushed. My father, the one I imagined, the one inside me, had to spend his days reliving his crime, mentally reenacting the details, feeling what it must have felt like inside me, the daughter he abused. He had to strip away the hardness which prevented him from empathy, the indifference that rejected responsibility, rejected even the notion of the apology itself. What is an apology? It is a humbling. It is a loss of grandiosity and superiority. It is an admission of wrongdoing. It is a surrender. It is an equalizer. It is making true connection with another human being. Apology is the antidote to the convenient and diabolical amnesia which grips our families and our country. Apologies rip open the lies, the denial, the illusions, the myth that keep the violence and the story in place. An apology is a remembering, a public acknowledgement that what occurred actually did occur. The powerful have been trained never to apologize. They make themselves the victims. That's what my father did. Even as he whipped me and threw me against the wall, he was the victim, reminding me always how it hurt him more than it hurt me, how I was the reason he had to behave like this. I made him do it. He had no choice. Some accused men in recent years from the Me Too movement have lost their jobs and careers and reputations after they have been called out. Some have gone to prison. But even when these men have come forward to describe what they have learned since being accused, they don't say the words, acknowledge the specificity of their crimes. They don't trace the history of their own stories or developments of distortions in their own psyches that would at least attempt to make sense of their brutality. They don't investigate the system of patriarchy and privilege that allowed, encouraged, and gave them cover and license for this violence. My father says in the book that for a man to apologize is to be a traitor to other men. Once one man admits he was wrong, the whole story of patriarchy begins to collapse. There are 4 essential steps to an apology I want to share with you this morning. 1, investigate one's own history and look at what led you to act the way you acted. What went into making you the kind of person, a man, a white person, a settler, who was capable of such harm to another? Discovering the origin, the history of our actions is key to making sure they don't happen again. 2, admit in detail what you have done, Broad strokes will not be effective, i.e., I'm sorry I hurt you, I'm sorry if you feel bad. Freedom is in the details for both the person making and receiving the apology. I'm sorry I threw you down the stairs. I'm sorry I tore your clothes off and didn't listen to your voice screaming for me to stop. The more detailed the apology, the more freedom will ensue. 3, allow yourself to feel and understand the impact of your harm on your victim. This requires opening the portals of empathy inside you, climbing inside the feelings and being of the person you have been mean to or cruel to. 4, take full responsibility for what you have done and make the apology or the amends. All of these steps indicate that it would be impossible for you to do anything like this again. You would have gone through a process, an alchemical process that would have changed you forever. I've asked many women what justice would look like after they've been sexually abused, battered, incested, or harassed. Some women rightfully demand punishment, prison time for their perpetrators, public exposure, loss of jobs, end of careers. Some women simply want their perpetrators to disappear off the face of the earth forever. But many women I've spoken to say that in order to heal, in order to move on, what they need the most is for their perpetrator to acknowledge the truth of what he has done. They want their perpetrator to recognize them as a full and real human being, acknowledge the harm he has caused, and to feel remorse and heartbreak. They need to see their perpetrator has taken responsibility for his actions and done extensive work to understand what made him commit this violence in the first place. They need to know the depth of his reckoning will prevent him from ever committing violence against any other person again. You know, so many of us have been waiting. I think of brave Anita Hill and Christine Blasey Ford. I think of the comfort women in the Philippines and all across Asia who were kidnapped and raped by the Japanese soldiers during World War II. They have stood every Thursday at vigils in various Asian countries for 70 years, waiting for the apology to come. Most of them have died now. The rest are ailing and feeble. They have never heard the words, and they will never rest. The question is, how do we address patriarchy, the paradigm? How do we get under the story in order to uproot it rather than continuing to ram up against it? We have to offer a doorway rather than a locked cell. We have to move from humiliation to revelation, from curtailing behavior to changing it, from, as my friend Tony Porter says, from calling men out to calling them in. We need to teach apology the way we teach prayer, for it is in fact a practice, and it requires practice to get it right. It demands the devotion and intensity and thoroughness of prayer. It demands the vulnerability of that petition and the humility. Each one of us humans is flawed and imperfect, engaged hopefully in uplifting our souls and evolving our humanity. I believe the apology is the medicine, that salve that cleanses and fortifies and allows us to continue on. But it must be taught. It must be practiced. I hear survivors often being told they need to forgive their perpetrators and move on. I worry how we use that word forgiveness, how somehow we skip the vital piece of reckoning and accounting before any form of true forgiveness can occur. In many religions, there is confession, there is an admitting of wrongdoings, which generates forgiveness. The onus, and I'm going to say this clearly, is not on the victim to forgive. This feels like a forced mandate and a kind of repetition, a new form of abuse. And without the discourse and action of the apology, it can be hollow and an inorganic act, not truly releasing the victim or the perpetrator from guilt and rage and actually causing more harm. I realize even the desire for the apology is a tall order. It would mean, at the very least, a remaking of human consciousness. It would mean becoming vulnerable and lost and risking that the exploration and expurgation could potentially mean a radical change of identity and position and power. But what it could also mean is being involved in a process which has the possibility of bringing us into a time where the tyranny of misogyny, which has robbed men of their hearts and tenderness and humanity, is transformed into a time of equality, peace, and loving connection between men and all women. Our imagination is our most powerful weapon. We can conjure the dead. We can rewrite their stories. We can make them see us as they have never seen us. We can get them to reveal themselves and see themselves, and we can transform the underlying narrative that has caught us in an ongoing cycle of violence, punishment, more violence. You know, I often ask myself, what am I doing here on earth? My answer, the older I get, is simple. I am here to get free. Free of my rancor, free of my pain, free of racism and reversing the legacy I carry as a white person, free of prejudice and unkindness, free of my self-loathing, free of my desire to hurt, free to live in my body, free of jealousy, ego, free of not feeling like enough, free of comparison, free to be my authentic self, free to serve that which is divine. Only then can I manifest my real purpose, our real purpose, which is to love. And I don't mean a sentimental, touchy-feeling kind of love. I mean the fierce love, a love born in the alchemy of the wound, of the shadow, of the shamanic fire, of the true and radiant apology. So I ask you this morning, what apology are you being called to make? What wound do you need to uncover and enter into in order to face the truth about who you have harmed in order to be free? What apology may you never receive that you need to write for yourself? What lengths are you willing to go to free yourself and your victim from a lifetime, a legacy of pain and suffering? Will you practice apology? Thank you so much. It has been such a joy to be with you this morning. Have a beautiful day.